Good morning, everyone. I am here with my friend Chrisella today, and we are going to be talking about podcasting. So I've always had these secret fantasies of doing a podcast. I even once upon a time reserved like all the social channels, all the domains, like everything I would need. It's just there waiting for me. But podcasting is a little bit intimidating for some people, one, but the other thing is it's an amazing opportunity. It's an amazing marketing opportunity. If you're in business, it's an amazing opportunity to really showcase your expertise. It's an amazing opportunity to help people right now when so many of us need help. So Chrisella, why don't you introduce yourself a little bit and tell us how you became passionate about podcasting?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you, Lydia, for having me on today. It's so great to see you with, being able to connect with you right now. So I started with podcasting several years ago when I was just getting my business started. I was working from home all the time, and I was experiencing a lot of these things that we're experiencing now, where I never left the house. I only talked to maybe one other person, like who was my spouse, and then my dogs. And so it got to the point where like my dogs knew when I was leaving the house because I put on jeans. So they got very excited because things were happening.
You're describing my first year in business too. I would get so lonely that I would like my husband would come home from work and I would like pounce.
Yeah, like it's
me as like a puppy.
It's super lonely. And so what I finally decided to do was I was like, okay, I've got to talk to other people, even if it's people who aren't here in my state. So I started podcasting and setting up interviews with other really cool people to kind of talk to them and just to talk about business. Talk about like what it was like to start a business, especially women business owners, and what it was. And that kind of morphed into just talking about leadership as women as well. And so my podcast was originally called Bosses Who Brunch. I rebranded it a little while ago because I decided the name didn't quite fit anymore. And now it's called The Lonely Ladypreneur, which I feel fits a lot better with everything. Yeah.
It feels particularly applicable right now.
Yeah, very much so. My company is called Humble and Hustle Studios, and we work with small businesses and trying to figure out their digital marketing strategy, get them online, figure out their voice and their place online, and help them build up marketing strategies for a sustainable business. And I really think podcasting is a really important part of that. Podcasting has always kind of been part of my business. And a few years ago, I was contacted by a couple of other podcasters who were like, hey, there are all these podcast events around here. Why don't we do one for Utah? And so now I also am the co-founder of the Utah Podcast Summit, which is, it's super interesting running an events company right now. So let me tell you what, but we're still hosting it this year. It's just going to be online, and which I think is a big opportunity for us. I am excited about that.
You know, it is an opportunity to expand outside of purely Utah, which I think is fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely.
So with podcasting, and it seems like every podcaster I talk to says, I kind of stumbled into it and I didn't know what I was doing when I started. It is a relatively new medium. And so I feel like that is kind of the standard. Right. So as you're stumbling into it, what are a few common, I won't say mistakes, but things that kind of make people stumble a little bit as they're stumbling into it?
Right. There are a couple of big things that I see that happen with every podcaster, and there are ways to get around it as well. Perfect. So the first thing that I see is that people decide, I want to do a podcast, and they just jump into it with no planning at all. And maybe this happens a little bit more with men, but I do see people, I don't know, they just jump into it, and there's not a whole lot of planning. They're just like, I'm going to podcast and I'm going to talk about stuff, and it's going to be interesting. And so what ends up happening is they start their show, and they might have a co-host, and they're just kind of chatting. They're just talking about things that they care about. They might not have a direction with their content. And that is very, very boring for an audience. Like the audience does not care about your little chit chat stuff. And I hear this from a lot of people where they're listening to a podcast and the chit chat at the beginning goes on for way too long. People get bored and they're just like, no, I'm not listening to the rest of the episode. And so anything else you might have after that is just completely lost. And so that happens when you don't have a good direction with your podcast. The other thing that I see that really trips up podcasters at the beginning is they get very stuck in making it perfect from the get-go. And I see this happen to women a lot. They get very stuck with, okay, well, I don't have the perfect logo. I don't have the perfect name. I'm not sure exactly what I'm going to talk about forever. All those sorts of things. And so my encouragement is to kind of try to find a balance between those sorts of things. Know what you're going to talk about, have a plan for what you're going to talk about, and get to the point when you're talking, but also don't get stuck in perfectionism. It doesn't have to be perfect. People are very forgiving. And if you don't have the perfect name, the perfect logo, change it. I changed my podcast because I decided I didn't like it anymore. It doesn't have to be perfect forever from the get-go. You can change things. You can change direction. Just make sure that the content that you're providing actually has value for people.
And I love what you said about finding a balance between planning and diving in. Because it really is true. The biggest thing that holds most people back is a little bit of that fear of starting.
Absolutely.
And you can overcome, and sometimes you compensate by that fear by just saying, I'm just going to do it. I'm going to do it. And I don't even care. Or you plan to the point that you plan yourself out of your podcast and plan yourself to death and you never get started.
Exactly.
And so one of the things that I've noticed with a lot of podcasters when they're starting out is they're not overcoming their fear by not finding resources, finding mentors or finding podcasts about podcasting or, talking to other podcasters and asking what made your life easier? What do you wish you'd known? So what do you wish you'd known when you were very first starting?
Oh my gosh. That's a good question. I wish I had just known about how to find the podcasting community that was out there, because there are so many resources out there. For women who are just getting started with podcasting, there's the She Podcasts group. In general, there's groups around all of the big podcasting conferences that are out there, PodFest, Podcast Movement, the Utah Podcast Summit has one as well. And there are a lot of podcasts about podcasting that give you resources, that give you statistics, that kind of tell you which way the industry is going, and that are very responsive when you send in questions. So the two that I can think of off the top of my head that I would recommend for people just getting started, one is called The Feed, and that's run by a couple of the people behind the scenes at Libsyn. Libsyn is one of the bigger podcasting hosts out there. And they are really, really great, really supportive of the community. If you have a question and you email them, they will answer you and help you out. The other podcast about podcasting that's really great is She Podcasts. It started as a podcast, became a community, became a conference, and they are great. They talk about questions, they talk about podcasting and all these sorts of things. So I would definitely recommend those two things. The last thing that I can think of that I really wish that I'd had when I got started, it's actually something that we at the Utah Podcast Summit developed because we realized it was like, oh my gosh, I wish I'd had this. So we went and developed it. We call it the podcast canvas. And so if you're an entrepreneur, you're probably familiar with like the lean business model canvas. We created something similar to that. That's so just for planning out your podcast. And it kind of walks you through the content, the episodes that you're going to create, the marketing strategy, who your audience is, your goals, your costs, all those sorts of things. And, even still, it helps me out with my podcast. My other co-founder, he's been podcasting for even longer than I have. And he he still uses it for his podcast. So and that's available on the Utah Podcast Summit website, just utahpodcastsummit.com. And it's a free resource. It's Creative Commons. We opened it up because we were like, yeah, we know podcasters need this. And hopefully it'll help you find that balance between over planning and under planning, and kind of help you start developing your content.
I love the idea of just a little bit of a roadmap, because sometimes that's the hardest part, where you're like, I've got an idea. I maybe have a co-host. I just need a little bit of direction to kind of get me started and to get me over that initial roadblock of like, oh, this is scary. So how do you overcome that fear of putting yourself out there, putting your voice out there, feeling like you have value in what you're offering? Because that's the other thing I hear from people quite often is, I don't know if anybody cares about what I have to say, and it's scary.
Oh, man. So that was something that I did worry about for a while. Is like, is this even working out for it? Like, does anybody care? Is anybody getting value from this? And so what I kind of started to do is I started looking at the questions that people were asking me about marketing, about business, about all these different things, or questions that I was hearing from people in the community. And I realized, I was like, okay, I have experience with this. I can provide a perspective. And so I started just talking about these things. And another way I got around it is I started doing live videos on my Facebook page as well. And I think live videos are so much more intimidating than podcasting, because with podcasting, you're not seeing my face. It's just my voice.
You can edit and
yeah, you can edit it, but live videos are like very intimidating. So now that I do those, I'm like, oh, podcasting, that's easy. But yeah, just, remember that you can edit it, that if you make a mistake, you can go back and re-record it. And the other thing that really helped me is I interview people. I interview other business owners for their perspective, and that kind of takes some of the pressure off of me, where, like this, we can sit down and have a conversation with people. And there might be some parts of it that some people find really valuable, and other parts that other people find really valuable. And so, even if this podcast episode isn't super valuable to everyone, there will be something out there, as long as I keep listening to those questions people are asking me and trying to find a way to answer those questions.
So as people are getting started, I know that some podcasters recommend kind of having a stable of content when you launch. Others say just go for it if creating that stable of content is going to keep you from doing it. What do you recommend as far as people kind of creating and launching? How should they do that?
So if you had asked me this question maybe 3 months ago, I would have had a different answer.
I know. So much has changed.
So what I would have said before is, when you launch, have about 7 episodes ready to publish, because then people can sit down and, they listen to one episode, they really like it, they're going to want to keep listening. But then I heard some statistics that changed my mind on this. I visited PodFest, and at PodFest, a couple of the people from Libsyn, again, they get up on stage and they talk about statistics the same way that they do on their podcast, The Feed. And one of these statistics said that shows that start with 7 to 10 podcast episodes, they actually do worse in the long run. And the reason for that is because they're launching with a bunch of content, and they don't have the time to get that listener feedback, because they've already gotten into this rhythm with their content, and it takes a little more time to adjust based on listener feedback. They've just been creating in a vacuum. Whereas if you start with maybe 1 to 3 episodes, then you can have some stuff out there for people to listen to, but then you also have the opportunity to get feedback from people and to improve the podcast. And it really helps in the long term. So
you've got a shorter runway.
You do have a shorter runway.
Pivot faster.
Yeah. Exactly. But so you just have to make sure that when you launch, you're really pushing it out there and asking people for your feedback, or for feedback. Ask your friends, ask your business associates, post in one of the podcasting community groups and ask for feedback on your podcast, and just make sure that because you have that shorter runway, you've got a shorter time period to get that feedback. So just make sure you're really getting out there, and that will help with your launch anyway, rather than feeling like you're a little bit more complacent. You have more stuff in the bank or for people to listen to.
I think that is fascinating. And interesting statistics, interesting numbers. I really like that and hadn't necessarily considered that before. So one of the other things that I think, purely from a marketing standpoint, when we're planning out marketing and when we're planning out strategy, we're planning it out, quarterly. We're looking into the future and making plans now so that we can have all the moving pieces ready to go and we have time to do them. And we're not doing what I call desperation marketing.
That's a good way to put it. I love that.
I might need to trademark that one. But so with podcasting, how far out do you want to kind of plan, even if you're not recording your episodes, how far out do you want to kind of plan them?
So we try to recommend about 2 months. When we put together the podcast canvas, we put in a section for you to plan out 8 podcasts. And so if you're doing a weekly show, that's 2 months of podcasts. And that way you can have a good plan in advance. You can sit down, start scheduling interviews, start scheduling recordings, or if you do a solo show, that gives you some time to research and get prepared for that sort of stuff. I know some people who will schedule 6 months of content in advance. They will just schedule, or they'll sit down and plan a week where they just sit there and record episodes and then publish it. And it's interesting because when all of these, all the shutdowns started happening and everything started changing very quickly, you could tell some of the people who had done that in advance because they had to put in an introduction to their podcast saying, this was recorded before the pandemic. So some of this might not be applicable anymore, but we're publishing it anyway. So there are some risks with that in that you might record in advance and you publish and something's not applicable anymore. Or it's outdated information. But for the most part, planning a couple of months in advance, you don't get into that desperation marketing. You don't have to sit there and scramble to get that interview ready, or you don't run into the situation where you're like, well, I'm out of time to edit this week. Guess the podcast isn't going out. Because I do see that happen with a lot of podcasters. And when that starts happening regularly, it burns people out. And then they start to do what's called pod fading, which means their podcast just kind of trickles away and then stops. And that's really sad. I really hate to see that. So planning in advance can really help you get past that.
Well, and burnout is real.
Mm-hmm.
Podcasting burnout, like anything that you kind of start because you're passionate about it and it sounds like fun, sometimes you don't realize going in just what it's going to be or how time consuming it's going to be, or you start to feel overwhelmed or burnt out. So how do you combat that?
I would say the first thing is don't be afraid to take a break, because
it is allowed.
Right. Yeah. Breaks are absolutely allowed. I'm actually taking a little bit of a break right now with my podcast, partially because before the pandemic hit, I had a family emergency as well. And I just haven't been able to pick things back up yet with everything else going on, So, just don't feel bad about taking a break. Do your best to communicate with your audience, even if you're just recording like a 2-minute episode to publish that's saying, hey, we're taking a break. This is what's going on. We expect to be back at this date. That's okay. And people will understand. But just try to be transparent about that and communicate about that.
Well, give yourself a chance to recharge and resupply your creative juices.
Absolutely.
One thing that I've noticed is some podcasters actually build in breaks by having seasons.
Yes, that is. Yes. And a lot of podcasters will take a break over the holidays because, nobody wants to try to fit in podcast recording during the holidays. Build in breaks for yourself. Just say, we're taking our scheduled summer break. We're taking our scheduled holidays break, that sort of thing. Or do the seasons, whatever, as long as you keep to something that's fairly consistent and you communicate that with your audience, people will understand.
So one of the other things that I frequently hear from people that are thinking about starting a podcast is, what are some of the tools that I need? You
Yeah.
know, what do I need? Do I need headphones? Do I need a special microphone? What is it that I need to get started?
Sure. So you don't need to spend a whole lot of money. Like, I do see podcasters who get started, and it's very easy to spend a lot of money on podcasting. It can be a very expensive hobby if you let it be. It also doesn't need to be. So you can see here, I've got this little microphone here. It's attached to a stand that's attached to my desk. The microphone itself cost only about $25. On Amazon, it's a AudioCAD U4F microphone. I think it's sold out on Amazon right now, but like everything's sold out on Amazon right now.
Right. It's
So
a weird time.
yeah. But once it's back in stock, it is not very expensive, and it gets pretty good audio. And it just plugs into your computer via a USB. I also have another microphone that's an ATR 2100. It costs a little bit more, about $100, and it has the option for a USB plug-in or something that plugs into an audio recorder. And so like that whole setup can get to be like a little bit more expensive, a little fancier. You don't necessarily need that. This little thing here is called a pop filter. It's so that when I talk into it, you're not getting like the sound.
Yeah.
Because that really can, yeah, or the sound from S's. Yeah. And so that's to kind of help combat that, because when you have somebody's voice in your ears, that can get very annoying very quickly. Also, not very expensive. You can get it for, $10 to $15. For headphones, you don't need much more than your regular earbuds. So I've got fancy headphones, but that's because I'm editing audio a lot. And so I like to have something that's cancels out the noise around me a little bit more. So you don't have to do very much with that either. Then for actually editing the audio, there's a lot of tools out there, and it's just kind of what your preference is. There, you can go the route of getting, saying like an Adobe Creative Cloud subscription, where you use the Adobe tools for audio editing there. Or you can get something called Hindenburg. I really like Hindenburg. That's a one-time. Yeah, and that's a one-time thing where you pay for it and then you get access to use it. Or you can, even with if you have an Apple computer, the programs that come with that, was it Audio Garage? I can't remember the name of it now.
Yep.
Yeah.
It is something.
GarageBand. GarageBand.
Apple right now.
Yeah. I don't use it myself, but yeah, so there are free tools out there that you can use for editing the audio. And if you're just getting started and you just need to learn how to do it, those are great ways to get started. And there's there are some big shows that edit with free tools, so don't feel like you need to spend a ton of money on stuff.
Yeah. And one of the things, if you're learning how to do that, like anytime I'm learning a new tool, I go straight to YouTube, because I guarantee that there is a YouTube video out there that's like, here's how you use this editing tool. Here's how you edit a podcast. Here's how you, cut out this annoying whatever.
Absolutely.
There are great free tutorials out there that are just there.
Yeah. And also, like all the Facebook communities that I was mentioning, there's also one for podcast editors. But if you go into any of these communities and just say, hey, I'm stuck with this one problem, how do I get around it? The podcast community is so supportive and so willing to help people out with questions. I really love it. So, if you have a question, ask it. There will be somebody who has an answer for you.
That is one of the things that I really, really love about the podcasting community. Even though I'm not a podcaster myself, I have clients who are, and so I'm a member of several communities so that I can ask those questions. And people have always been so fantastic and so kind and so supportive. And that is something that's really amazing.
Yeah. So I was just going to say, we all stumbled into this and we're all learning. So we like to help each other learn so that we can all improve together.
So one other thing that I hear quite often, one other question that seems to come up on a regular basis is, once I've started my podcast, how do I get it out there to the world?
Yes. Yeah, I see this question a lot. And one of the big mistakes I'm going to warn people about right now is don't try to host your podcast directly from your website. Some people will try to do that. They'll just try to upload the audio file directly to your website. It's a really great way to get your website host to kick you off their platform. Just because that takes so much bandwidth from them. They don't like to do that.
It'll bog down your website to the point that it won't even function.
Right. Yeah. So don't do that, please. There are tools out there, podcast hosts that you upload your audio to them and they host it. They take care of all the bandwidth streaming and all that sort of stuff there. And they also push it out to the podcast player platforms such as Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, all these different things that are out there. So a couple of those podcast hosts are, I mentioned one already, Libsyn. That's probably the biggest one that's out there. They don't have a free version, but you can upload a podcast there for $5 a month, as long as you don't hit their bandwidth fees. And once you upload the audio there, to keep your podcast published and live forever, it is $5 a month there forever. But it's not that much to keep a podcast going if that's something that's part of your brand strategy there. Another one that's out there is Podbean. I've been looking into Podbean because Podbean has a live video streaming option that's a part of it as well, where they take the video stream that you've done and integrate that into your podcast RSS feed as well.
Which people are starting to appreciate, especially now when you're like, I'm so lonely. I want to see faces, not just voices.
Exactly. So Podbean is another really great one out there. And there are a bunch of different options. Anchor is a free one that a lot of people use. Anchor. So if you're just trying to get started and just want to play around with it, Anchor is a great place to start. They started a couple of years ago and then Spotify actually purchased them. So Anchor is a Spotify platform now. So yeah, there are different options out there. Just kind of look around and see what's going to fit you the best with all of that. And so what these platforms will do is you upload your audio and they create what's called an RSS feed. That RSS feed is what is given to all the other players that you might listen to your podcast on. And whenever you publish a new episode, it's added to your RSS feed. And that's how your podcast gets out to the world. It's pretty simple. It's kind of funny.
Which is lovely. So don't be intimidated by thinking, oh, I have to go upload it to Apple and I have to go upload it here and I have to go upload it here. You can also have your RSS feed directly to a website, your website, for example. Yes. And that way you're not hosting, you're
hosting it directly on your website. Yeah. And all of the podcast hosts that I mentioned, they have a way where you can get an embed code of your episode, and then you can add that embed code, say, to like a blog article or something like that. And then you've got that blog going out on your website with a little bit of text that's like a description of the podcast. And in that way, you're kind of, helping the SEO of your website even without it becoming a problem for the bandwidth of your website.
Absolutely. So let's just touch very briefly on a podcast as a marketing tool, as a personal branding tool.
Yeah.
I think that because podcasts are relatively new, it means that there's less competition in a lot of ways for getting your content out there and getting noticed. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So when I see a lot of podcasters, when they start, one of their first questions that they ask is, how do I make money off of this? And most of the time what they're thinking is, how do I sell an ad that will pay me directly, or somebody pays me directly so I can read an ad on their podcast? But that's not the only way to make money off of your podcast. And I think there are so many opportunities out there for business owners to think about. So one way that you can think of your podcast is as a brand building strategy. Who are you as a company? What are your values? What value do you provide to your customers? Talk about that on your podcast. Break that down every week when you're talking to people. Ask people to come onto your podcast who are in line with your company values and talk to them about the business. Kind of like what you're doing with this video series. Talk to people in the community and bring that information to your listeners. When you're providing your listeners value, you're building that loyalty with them. They will remember you as an authority in your field. And when you come back to them or when they come back to you with a question, you know, you're going to be the source of information for them because you have that relationship already, even if you don't even know about it.
You're literally a voice in their head.
Exactly. Like when you have somebody's voice going right into your ear, it builds an intimacy there. So think of podcasting as being like a very intimate medium. Even if you're not interacting with people, people think that they are friends with you because of just the psychology of podcasting.
Yeah.
The other thing that you can think about with your podcast is if you have something like an online course or a book or something like that, you don't need to sell ads to other people's products. Talk about your own products on your podcast. So mention saying, this week our podcast is sponsored by my company, and my company is offering this online course to our listeners for a discounted price for the next 3 weeks. So get on that, use that code. Right there, you don't have to try to promote somebody else's company while also promoting your own brand. You can promote your own services within a podcast and drive that marketing funnel over to your own business.
And for me, and from my perspective, I would much rather drive people to my services through a podcast than tell people to go somewhere else or go buy another product. It just means that I'm increasing my own value through my own efforts, which is one of the reasons why I started my business in the first place.
Exactly. So think of it as kind of like a top of the line or, top of the marketing funnel strategy. You're building your brand, you're getting awareness out there, you're reaching out to new customers, and then you're driving them to the next step to take an action. And just remember to have that call to action in every podcast, because people won't remember it after the first one. They might not even remember it after the third one, but eventually they'll remember it and they'll take that action.
Perfect. Well, any final thoughts, anything you'd like to wrap up with?
If you're thinking about doing a podcast, start planning it out, figure out what direction you're going to go, and don't be intimidated by it. It's a really supportive community where your questions are going to get answered. Nobody's going to try to tell you to stop podcasting. Your podcast is your voice, and you definitely should do it. I recommend it for everybody.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. And one last time, how can people find you if they have any further questions?
Yeah, so we have the Utah Podcast Summit group. You can find that on Facebook. Our page is the Utah Podcast Summit. We actually have a little workshop coming tomorrow night, Thursday night, where we have a few podcasters pitching their podcast for the Voice of the West Award. That's going to be a virtual event, and that information's on our Facebook page. And otherwise, you can find me at Humble and Hustle Studios on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter as well.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. And it was lovely getting to see you and chat kind of face.
It's so good to see you. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. This was delightful. I'll kind of monitor any comments on this particular live stream for the next 24 hours and pass those along if anybody has any further questions. Thank you, everybody, for listening in and hanging out with us. Have a great day.